We have followed the story from Abraham to Jacob. Abraham gave a tenth. Jacob vowed a tenth. But what happened after that? Genesis doesn't tell us. In Genesis 14, after Abram returned from rescuing Lot and defeating the kings who had taken him captive, Abram gave Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of God Most High, a tenth of the spoils. The Hebrew text uses the word ma'asher, meaning a tenth or tenth part. But Genesis does not record Abraham establishing a recurring practice of giving 10% of his income. It records this particular tenth in connection with the events of that battle. And after Genesis 14, the subject of the tenth is not mentioned again in the Genesis narrative until Jacob's vow in Genesis 28. Genesis continues through Abraham's later years. Isaac, Jacob, Esau, Joseph, famines, blessings, wars, deaths, and the growth of Jacob's family. Yet there is no further recorded act of tithing during this period. Then, in Genesis 28, the tenth appears again. Jacob says,
"And of all that you give me, I will give a tenth to you."
That is the second and final reference to a tenth in Genesis. But now comes the question, did Jacob ever fulfill the vow? Genesis gives us a remarkably detailed account of Jacob's life after Bethel. We are told about his wives, his children, his flocks, his increasing wealth, his departure from Laban, his return toward the land of Canaan. Then Jacob meets Esau again. Jacob sends ahead a substantial gift, hundreds of animals. Genesis records 550 animals in the gift Jacob prepared for Esau. And Esau says,
"Jacob, keep them. No, I beg you, it is to find favor. You do not need to do this."
Genesis does not explicitly calculate which brother was wealthier, but it clearly shows that Esau possessed substantial wealth.
"I have enough, Jacob. Keep them."
And this brings us to a question that deserves an honest answer. If giving a tenth automatically makes a person wealthy, what exactly are we supposed to make of Jacob? And what are we supposed to make of Esau? Genesis never says that Jacob became wealthy because he promised a tenth. In fact, when Jacob made his vow, God had already promised to be with him, protect him, multiply his descendants, give him the land, and bring him back. The blessing came before the vow. The vow did not purchase the promise. And yet, despite everything Genesis tells us about Jacob's life, Genesis never records Jacob fulfilling the vow. It doesn't tell us that Jacob paid the tenth. It doesn't tell us what he did with the tenth. It doesn't tell us whom he gave it to. It doesn't record a priest receiving it. It doesn't record a Levite receiving it. And it doesn't say that Jacob established a permanent 10% system for his household. The text simply doesn't tell us, so we should be careful. We cannot say, Jacob definitely never gave it. Genesis doesn't say that, but we also cannot say Genesis records Jacob faithfully paying his tenth. It doesn't. And that brings our journey through Genesis to an important conclusion. Abraham's tenth is recorded once. Jacob's tenth is recorded as a vow. And after Jacob makes that vow, Genesis gives us no narrative account of Jacob fulfilling it. There is no recorded payment, no recorded recipient, no recorded system of regular 10% giving established by Jacob. And there is no further recorded reference to tithing in Genesis. Genesis simply leaves the story there. So if the story doesn't end with Jacob, where does the tithe appear next? And what changed? The answer begins in a completely different setting, when the tithe became a law. Genesis does not present tithing as a guaranteed mechanism for becoming wealthy. Jacob's wealth is described in the context of his labor God's providence and his dealings with Laban, Esau is also presented as a man of substantial wealth. The text never says, Jacob became rich because he vowed a tenth.
I am Moses, I wrote Genesis. But the story isn't over. Should we continue to the next chapter? Comment next if you want us to continue.